Hello and welcome to this video. On this video, we are going to be asking ourselves whether Bono, the lead singer of U2, is a musical genius or just simply annoying. Of course, he could be both or neither. And by the end of this video, I will have established whether he is an annoying musical genius or just a musical genius or just annoying or not either of these. Bono was born in Dublin in Ireland on the 10th of May 1960. His real name is Paul David Hewson. Growing up, his teenage musical idols were Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, David Bowie and Mark Bolan of T-Rex. At the age of 14, he got given the name of Bono Vox, which is Latin, I believe, for good voice. In 1976, Larry Mullen Jr. posted an ad in his school for musicians to form a band, and U2 was formed. Originally, they wanted to play cover versions, Beatles songs and maybe a bit of Beach Boys, but they weren't good enough to do this, so they decided instead to play songs that they had written. This was really spurred on by the contemporary punk scene that was emerging at that time. They kept working and playing and practicing, and after playing various local venues and building up a local following, they signed a management deal in 1978, and their management enabled them in 1979 to record their first demo. This became their first EP called 3, and it was released only in Ireland, but it sold relatively well, selling around about 1,000 copies. Because of this, Island Records became interested in them, and in 1980 they signed to that label. Their first album was called Boy and was released in October 1980. When it came out, it received genuinely positive reviews. Paul Morley of the M&E called it touching, precocious and full of archaic and modernist conviction, whilst Declan Lynch of Hot Press said he found it almost impossible to react negatively to U2's music. The album peaked at number 52 in the UK and number 63 in the US. At the end of this video, when I give my assessment of Bono, I will actually give an assessment of this album and many of the U2 albums to establish whether Bono is a musical genius or not. But for the moment, let's stay on the story of Bono. Listening to it now, the sound that they create, which was very guitar-based, at odds with a lot of the synth pop that was around at the time, has not dated at all. It still sounds fresh and energetic. And one of the things that was very interesting about Bono was his incredible vocals, which again was not the fashion at the time. In 1981, they recorded their second album, which was called October. When they'd gone in the studio to record Boy, U2 had written over 40 songs and had those songs to pull from. When they went in to record October, they didn't have that luxury. Plus, the songs that they were working on were affected by the fact that Bono lost his lyrics on a tour of America. The producer of October was Steve Lillywhite, who had also produced the first album. And so he brought them in and enabled them to start writing in the studio. This created a fresher sound and also showed the band that had developed in their competency and flair. This album, when it was released, was a little bit more successful in the UK, charting at 11, but did not do as well in the US. A single was released called Gloria, and it was played on MTV pretty regularly. The sound of the album is more expansive and the band are more competent. The production is more polished. This is another great album. Bono's vocals are even stronger here. In 1982, they went back into the studio and eventually their third album, War, came out. This is the album where they really nailed the U2 sound, a defining sound for the 1980s for guitar-based bands. It contained their first big hit, which was called New Year's Day, and it also contains their first really sublime classic recording, which is called Sunday Bloody Sunday, and is about the troubles in Ireland. Bono had emerged as a lyricist that moved between sort of symbolic religious imagery to a sort of pacifist approach to war. The sound on this album is also even more expansive, where they have added violins and also backing vocals. This really is one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. U2 had arrived. They were one of the great bands of the 1980s and seemed to be able to take the expansive rock and roll grandiosity of bands like Led Zeppelin and David Bowie from the 70s, but combine that with a punk aesthetic. Unlike many what we could call indie bands at that time, U2 were able to play arenas and stadiums. One of the things that's interesting at this point is U2 are aware that they have made perhaps the greatest album they're ever going to make with the album War. Where do you go from here? They need to change their sound if they need to stay relevant. And going back into the studio for the fourth album, that's exactly what they did. They went in with a mind to experiment. They dropped Steve Lillywhite as a producer and instead brought in the more artsy and more fartsy Brian Eno. And then Clayton said, we were looking for something that was a bit more serious, a bit more arty. And also The Edge was a big admirer of Brian Eno's more ambient and weird works. They also brought in, as a producer, Daniel Lanois. The decision to hire Daniel Lanois, I think, came from Chris Blackwell, who was very worried that Eno was about to take his prized possessions down a much more artsy-fartsy route. Just when the band was about to achieve high levels of success, Eno would, to quote Chris Blackwell, bury them under a layer of avant-garde nonsense.
When I first went to Ireland to work with U2, they wanted to record in an unusual location. They didn't want to be in the conventional recording studio anymore. They wanted to be in a place that had historical significance. And they chose Slane Castle,
right
in Slane, right where the Battle of the Boyne had been fought. Mm-hmm. And that was the defining battle that allowed the Brits to take over Ireland. So it's a heavy place. And so we set up the studio in that location.
And then we've gone with number one take after we've done like 6, 7, or 8.
That's the thing. I would just like to know that we...
Of course, when this album came out, it was even more successful than War. And with this new sound, they had reinvented themselves. The big single off that was Pride. And again, I believe this to be one of the greatest songs, singles, records of the 1980s. U2 were really hitting hard and were one of the great bands at the time. If they had called it a day here, this album would be mentioned in the same breath as Talk Talk. Lanois and Eno proved to be a great production duo, and although U2 were sceptical of Lanois after working with him and realising his ability to arrange and compose music, enabled them to refine their songwriting. On the 13th of July 1985, U2 performed at the Live Aid benefit concert at Wembley Stadium before a crowd of around about 72,000 fans and in front of a worldwide television audience of around about 1.5 billion people. During their 12-minute performance of Bad, Bono climbed down from the stage to embrace and dance with a female fan he had picked out of the crowd. This seemed to chime with the viewers of Live Aid, and after Queen's incredible performance at that show, U2 probably had the second most memorable performance. The fact that Bono had climbed off the stage showed a real need and desire to connect with the audience on that day. But Bono's impromptu departure from the stage extended the length of Bad. The band was sat there jamming in the background while he was jumping around in the audience. And this cut it into their allotted time, forcing them to drop Pride from their set list. And this, of course, was their biggest hit at the time. U2 thought they'd made a mistake, but in fact, I think this really consolidated them to a worldwide audience of being one of the greatest bands in the world. After a break of 2 years, they went back into the studio to record their next album, which was to become known as the Joshua Tree. Again, they utilised the same production team of Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois. After the success of War, after the success of The Unforgettable Fire, It's hard to believe that U2 were able to top that. This is one of the sublime albums of the 1980s. The record went to number 1 in over 20 countries, including the UK, where it received platinum certification only 48 hours after it was released. It sold 250,000 copies in the first week, making it the fastest seller in British chart history at the time. In the US, it spent 9 consecutive weeks at number 1. The album included the hit singles With or Without You, Still I Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, and Where the Streets Have No Name. The first 2 became the group's only number 1 hits in the US. Again, this is another of one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. And again, With or Without You, for me, is a sublime track, along with Sunday Bloody Sunday and Pride. These are 3 of the greatest records of the 1980s. In October 1988, the group released Rattle and Hum, a double album and a theatrically released documentary film that captured the band's experience with American roots music on the Joshua Tree tour. The extensive tours of America had made Bono and the band realise that they had very little knowledge of the roots of rock and roll from whence they came. And with Rattle and Hum, they decided to explore those roots. Up until this point, the band had been moving forward. They had been working on their sound and developing their sound and creating a new sound for the 1980s. With the Rattle and Hum, they went back to what they perceived was their rock and roll roots. The record featured 9 studio tracks and 6 live U2 performances, including recordings at Sun Studios in Memphis and collaborations with Dylan and B.B. King. The album was released and went on to sell 14 million records, but the film bombed. The film of Rattle and Hum was U2's first failure. Also, the reviews for Rattle and Hum were not all round good. Tom Carson from The Village Voice called it an awful record by almost any rock and roll fan standards, and said the group's failure did not sound attributable to pretension so much as to monumental know-nothingism. Perhaps they had exposed their ignorance of the music that they were trying to pay tribute to. We could see this as the end of the first phase of U2's career. They then went away, licked their wounds, and decided to come back completely reinvented, which they did in 1991 with the album Achtung Baby.
Hello there. Sorry to interrupt the show like this, but I just wanted to say near the beginning of the video, because it's a thing that proper YouTubers do, I would just like to ask you if it is possible, because I don't know how many times I've asked you, and if you haven't, you really should have by now. So if you haven't, could you please subscribe to the video? Please subscribe to the video. Please subscribe to the video.
Here, the band move away from their classic sound, and unlike Rattle and Hum, rather than looking backwards, they look forwards, and they start to bring in influences from industrial music, electronic music, working with Brian Eno to really push the sound and ambient scope of this album. This album was a roaring success, and many lists will put it as being one of the greatest albums ever made. One of the things that's interesting with this album is that Bono, rather than being so full of conviction, decided to almost spoof himself, and he came up with alter egos, including that of The Fly, which was inspired by a big pair of dark sunglasses that he found in the studio. This is strange because U2 up until this point had been a very earnest band, but now they were very postmodern and ironic. And their concerts up to this point had been fueled by their performance style and were quite stripped down. But here they now embarked on one of the biggest tours in music history, the Zoo Tour, which was an absolute riot of multimedia, video, props, and was all so theatrical and huge in its scope. This was then followed by the album Zeropa in '93, which received generally favourable reviews from the critics. Anthony De Curtis of Rolling Stone wrote in his 4-star review that the album was daring, imaginative and a great coda to Achtung Baby, and that it is varied and vigorously experimental, but its charged mood of giddy anarchy subfused with barely suppressed dread provides a compelling unifying thread. So we could see with Zeropa 93 that they had now been able to consolidate this new sound, and they were still relevant in the 90s, even though at this point the band had nearly been going for 20 years. In 1997, in their 21st year, they released the album Pop. This initially received favourable reviews from the critics. Barry Hoskins of Rolling Stone gave Pop a 4-star rating, praising the band's use of technology on this album. But other reviews were more critical. On this album, they really moved away from their rock and roll roots, exploring dance music and techno. Neil Strauss of the New York Times wrote that, from the band's first album Boy in 1980 through to the Joshua Tree in 1987, U2 sound inspired. Now it sounds expensive. He further commented that U2 and techno don't mix any better than U2 and Irony do. It did not sell well and is now seen as a failure. Pop 97 was the first album failure of U2. At this point, the band could have gone away and called it a day. But in 2000, they came back with the album All That You Can Leave Behind. This, again, was a huge success, and they reinvented themselves for the next decade. This album went on to sell 12 million copies. All That You Can Leave Behind is easy to relate to, full of solid songs that appeal to a wide audience with its clear notions of family, friendship, love, death and rebirth. This album seems to bring together the approach on Rattle and Hum of looking back to the history of music, but then the approach on Achtung Baby in looking forward. And it's a really great balance, neither imitating or paying tribute or being too slavish to modern popular music styles. As Caroline van Oosten de Boer said, this time it's soul music, not music about soul. In 2004, they went back to their original producer, Steve Lillywhite, threw away all the samples and electronica and decided to return to the sound that had made them famous originally. And this was in evidence on the album How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb in 2004. This received generally positive reviews from the critics and reached number 1 in 34 countries, including the US, where the first week of sales was nearly 1 million copies. And this nearly doubled the band's previous best. The album and its singles won all 8 Grammy Awards for which they were nominated. This return to a gritty sound was welcomed, and it contained an earnestness that we had not heard in this band for a while. Rob Sheffield of Rolling Stone described it as grandiose music from grandiose men, sweatlessly confident in the execution of their duties, believing the album was well served by not tamping down Bono's ego or ambitions. But the idea that Bono had an ego and ambitions seems to have emerged around about this time in 2004. In 2009, they released No Line on the Horizon. This album really seems to be about Bono's uncertainty about the relevance of them as a band. This album does not seem to have that much of a personality. It seemed to pass people by in a certain way. There's a follow-up to this album in 2014, Song of Innocence came out. And this was made available to more than 500 million iTunes customers in over 119 countries. It can be seen as the largest album release of all time. At this point in 2009, when people got up that morning and found that they had a U2 album forced into their collection, and that they had no way of deleting it or get rid of it, I would see as being more than anything else the factor that moved the perception of U2 from being an earnest and brilliant band that had made some of the greatest albums of the 80s to a sort of overblown, too rich, too powerful rock band that were no longer relevant. I am now going to have a talk to you in person. Well, this is in person, but you know what I mean. You'll be able to see my face, more conversational. I'm going to have a conversation with, not conversation, but it will be me talking to you. Anyway, that's what I'm about to do. You will now see me, and I will talk to you about my opinion of why people think Bono's annoying and whether I think is annoying, I will assess their musical achievements and then come out with an idea of whether Bono is genius or annoying or both or neither. So get ready for that, people. Sorry to interrupt this show in this rude and annoying way, but I just wanted to tell you about a few ways that you can support me here on YouTube and get access to even more weirder and wackier content. First of all, you could become a patron. You could become a free member or a paid up member. I have over 300 extra videos on there, and if you don't even want to become a member, please pop over, because you can access my collections where you can purchase even more weirder and wackier video content. If you want to support me financially with a little tip, buy me some biscuits or maybe some crisps, you could pop over to my PayPal tip jar. I also have a Substack where I have lots of clever, academic and thought out articles where I explain my ideas on art, culture and creativity in a more intelligent way than I do here, plus a whole ton of podcasts. If you want to know what my music sounds like, you can pop over to my Bandcamp. Over there, you'll be able to listen to over 50 albums, and if you want to access them all, you could become a subscriber. And last but not least, if you want to support the wonderful studio where I film these lovely videos, which is actually a charity trying to help people out in the community become more creative, here is the website where you could drop a few pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is in your country in there. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.
This has been a very interesting video to make. I've never been a real fan of U2, but even I, in my collection somewhere, have a copy of the Joshua Tree. This is how ubiquitous this band is. They are one of the greatest bands, really, of the whole history of rock music. And so it's very interesting doing the research and, creating the little history of U2 that you've just seen. The reason why I did it is because when I do my comedy videos and I sort of jump up and down and rant and, criticise certain musicians like Bruce Springsteen or Van Morrison or whoever it is, people will often put in the comments, they'll go, I find this musician really annoying or this musician really annoying. And some of them, for example, Bono, I just don't know that much about, So I thought, I don't know where the comedy would be. I don't know how I could take the mickey out of him. Sometimes I try and take the mickey out of people, and I don't really know that much about them at all. Those videos are comedy videos, and they're much more around the culture of rock music and how people think. It's lampooning that. I hate to tell you this. It's not always my opinion, but people like them. And I will keep doing them. So this is going to be the first in a series of 20 videos where I've identified the sort of top 20 musicians, rock stars, what you want to call them, that the viewers of this channel find annoying. And one on the list that got mentioned over and over again was Bono. And so the way these videos are going to work is I will do the research. You will see the research laid out as you've seen just now, and then I'll come on and give my opinion of whether I think this guy is annoying or not, but also establishing how musically talented they are. I've used the word musical genius, but that's a bit over the top. But just establishing, if they're the real deal, because I think that's very, very important. I think a lot of the reasons why we feel that certain musicians are annoying is because they're pompous and arrogant. Too confident in who they are. If you think of sort of Mick Hucknall back in the 1980s when Simply Red first emerged, and he turned around and said that he thought he was the greatest singer at the world at that time, and straight away I hated him from that moment on. And these things can really colour your viewpoint of whether someone's annoying or not. So the question of whether you're going to get a rant on one of these videos is a different thing, and I think the rants will come not because the person's actually that annoying, but because I doubt their musical credentials. I think that's what's far more important. So the question here is to firstly look at the musical credentials, and then secondly, look at the things that people might perceive as being annoying, and then question whether that is the case. So I have to be honest with this. I read up on the history of it, of the band. You know, I looked into it. I got all the photographs, you know, from when they were kids, and you know, I was like, God, they formed in 1976. You know, this is incredible. You know, next year U2 will have been going for 50 years. That's a really incredible, amazing achievement, that is. And no lineup changes except for a sort of standing drummer at the moment. That's impressive, that is. And you start to look into them as a band, and I decided to listen to not all the albums, but I was going to listen to all the albums up until that point where they dropped that album for free into iTunes, right? So I listened to all of those. I don't know what they've done since. Might not have done anything. That might be the whole lot. But that was the remit, because I really felt that was the turning point. That the only thing I really knew about U2 is when they did that thing and dropped that album on iTunes, everyone got really upset. They didn't like it, and I think there was a presumptiveness about that the fans and the non-fans didn't like. I think that's more to the point. It's the non-fans, isn't it? Anyway, so I read up about them, and you realise that they're not very skilled as musicians. You know, when they form the band, they can barely play. You could definitely tell this. And I put that first album on, which is called Boy. See, I might even remember the order now I've done my research. And Boy's incredible. And what you hear, they don't quite have the songs on the first album. They've got good songs. They're good songs, but they haven't got Sunday Bloody Sunday or Pride in the Name of Love. They haven't got one of those on there. But listening to the band, they sound incredible. And this is the great thing about U2. The first thing I've got to say is that Larry Mullen's drumming and the idiosyncratic way that he plays the drums, which is really, really interesting. He's a great drummer. The Edge's guitar playing, which might be sort of ambient and covered in delay and all that type of thing. We could crack that joke that if you just took all the delay off, it would sound like, my old man's a dustman. If you don't know that joke, then that won't make sense. Or if you're an American, that won't make sense either. But anyway, you can say that. And then Adam Clayton sort of just thumps away on eighth notes, doesn't he, in the background. But when you put it all together, they sound brilliant. That band, when they play together, sound not just good, brilliant. I remember the early 80s. I remember what was going on at that point, and I could never really buy into the Joy Divisions or the Cures. I did like them, but the thing they had was a lot of sort of shoegazery, not rock and roll. It was not what I was into. I was into Van Halen. U2's genius is to come from that school, the post-punk, sort of new wave, gothy, indie, whatever you want to call it, but create a style which is capable of playing stadiums. And that's there on the first album. What's more shocking for me, listening to it now as because when I heard these albums when I was a kid, I wasn't interested. I want to listen to Michael Schenker Group, but now I'm older. The thing that's shocking is Bono's voice. He's unbelievable. He's one of the greatest singers in rock music history. He's got his own sound. He's recognisable, but the power and the control. And if you go back and watch, say, Live Aid, where there's no tricks, there's no, it hasn't been fixed or anything. Everyone knew they could just got up on stage. Listen to the band and they sound perfect. Listen to Bono's voice. It's his intonation, his power, his control, his command of the audience. It's just astonishing. Bono is super, super talented. Right, this goes without saying. In terms of vocally, we are dealing with one of the great singers that's an equals of James Brown or Marvin Gaye, in my opinion. That first album's great, and as they start to develop their sound, they just get better and better. October shows you can hear the band is developing its own virtuosity as they go forward. It's like. And it's based upon U2's virtuosity. When I was playing with Robert Plant, I know I mention this every single video, but one of the albums that was a big touchdown for him was Wrecking Ball by Emmylou Harris. It was produced by Daniel Lanois. And so that album became a sort of touchstone in terms of what we were trying to achieve with the band and the sort of sound and the sort of approach to drumming. Now, of course, it was Larry Mullen Jr. on that album. And I remember listening to it and thinking, Daniel Lanois chosen Larry Mullen Jr. because he does something in the studio that's absolutely wonderful. So you could be a virtuoso drummer, but you could also provide drum beats that make the track sound amazing. And also, if you're really great, create drum beats which are sort of signature drum beats. Now, if you take a track like Pride in the Name of Love and you listen to the way he drops that floor tom on the E of the fourth beat in the bar, you know, bagong, you know, that there, that makes that drum beat a signature drum part. It's real genius. And then when you listen to all the parts that U2 are providing, all the instrumentalists are doing this. It's really brilliant writing. It's brilliant writing, brilliant singing. And as they develop, you hear them develop, they're really good on Boy, as they do October. It's even better in a way. And then when they get to War, it's really brilliant. And we get Sunday Bloody Sunday, we get, you know, New Year's Day, massive hit records. When you watch that, and that's incredible. And at that point, they are destined to become the biggest band in the world. Nyland Record knows, they know that. But the band, the thing with U2 is that they're different to a Led Zeppelin or a Deep Purple or any of those 70s bands, is that they've inherited the sort of moral earnestness of punk rock. And Bono doesn't want to sing about groupies and girls and getting drunk and all that type of stuff. He doesn't want to do the Aerosmith thing. They want to deal with the serious subjects. I think that Bono's desire to save the world may be the sort of beginnings of why people find him annoying. Looking at the history of this, U2 have come out of a very religious country. Bono himself is a religious Christian, and where Christian beliefs have split the country in half, and there has been, you know, a history of the Troubles in Ireland, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And U2 take a very Christian pacifist approach to politics. Now, all of this I can only commend, and I think it chimed with the times in the early 80s where, you know, musicians wanted to feel that they could change the world and use their power for good. And this culminates in Band Aid and Live Aid. And of course, U2 play a huge part in that. Bono is on the Band Aid single with his incredible voice that comes in and just destroys everybody else on that record. And of course, his performance of the Live Aid, as I covered. And so I find it to be, if I'm really honest, I find it hard to go, well, he shouldn't be like that. Why, who's he think he is, changing the world, blah, blah, blah. Now, when they were first doing this and singing like this, of course, they weren't multi-millionaires and friends with, you know, the heads of state and presidents and all this type of thing. But of course, the band, it's such huge success that it goes beyond celebrity. It's like when you start to look at the sales, and you realise they're bringing an album out and it's going number one in 20 countries. It's like selling 15 million. And then another album comes out and that sells 15 million. And the reason why this is the case is because U2, when it's been required for them to reevaluate who they are, they have. They have moved forward. They're not status quo or AC/DC. They have redone their sound. And at that point where they make War, and that album is a real masterpiece. It's absolutely brilliant. It's like the definitive early U2 sound. And then when they're at the point of, you know, taking over the world, they pull in Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno. And Brian Eno comes in and throws a spanner in the works. And it's a brave move because the Unforgettable Fire goes beyond that. And suddenly they have this new sound. As I said, I think when they went to America and they got interested in roots music and sort of Americana, and I always think this is a dodgy thing. This is where I'd say this is their first mistake, but they had to do it. Now, the album Rattle and Hum was a relative success, but the critics turned on them. Now, this is a very snotty 80s music critic, you know, that, oh, they're playing old music, you know, they should be all cutting edge, you know, it should be all, you know, like the Swans or whatever band they liked at the time, you know. I think the film, which before that they'd made a video called The Unforgettable Fire. A Live Under a Blood Red Sky, that's the one, sorry, which is just before The Unforgettable Fire. And this was incredible live footage, really captured something of that band live. You know, they had cameras on stage with them. You feel like you're on stage with U2. Absolutely brilliant. And so it made sense to make a sort of documentary film. Now, I can remember going to see that film. This is the reach of U2, is that I went to see Rattle and Hum at the Pictures, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed seeing BB King and all these people turning up, and I thought it was great. I don't remember it being some terrible travesty. I mean, so many people. It's not like Hysteria, the Def Leppard story, or Phantom in the Park, or that one Status Quo made. I'm doing a video on this. that film Status Quo made is just, the tax write-off is unbelievable. It's a decent film, black and white, bit pretentious. They have to go there. Then, as the 90s turned around, and I think this is something that U2 do, they seem every time the next decade comes in, they decide to change their sound. Now, the change that they make on Achtung Baby is astonishing when you consider that they'd made War, they'd made The Unforgettable Fire, and they'd made The Joshua Tree. 3 of the greatest albums in rock history. And I have to say this, I mean, if it's not my thing, but objectively when I put them on, they're utterly astonishing. A tune like With or Without You is utterly astonishing. It's incredible. Absolutely brilliant songwriting, brilliant execution, brilliant production, and of course it's a worldwide hit because it's so simple and direct, and yet it's idiosyncratically U2. The change they make on Achtung Baby, which is perhaps their greatest album, so U2's greatest album isn't the one that you would go, that's the one that represents U2. It doesn't. Achtung Baby sort of stands on its own. There's very few bands that have achieved this. Achtung Baby is one of the greatest albums ever made. I have glossed over it, but I think it's definitely in the 20 greatest albums ever made. It's astonishing. It's the coming together of the biggest band in the world with the avant-garde. Now, the big shift that they make is not a musical one at that point. What Bono does is and it's interesting because he looks at his earnest, moral, I want to change the world image, and he lampoons it. And I think this is where the audience don't quite get the joke. So when he creates these alter egos on Achtung Baby, and then they go out on tour with the most opulent sort of Pink Floyd The Wall-esque tour in history, it was the biggest tour in history. They are lampooning the whole rock and roll hoopla. And it's quite interesting because Bono, when you look at the interviews with him, the dark sunglasses suddenly come on because he discovers he's got glaucoma and he has to wear these glasses. And the overriding thing that has come across for me doing this video is I've watched a lot of interviews with Bono, and he is a thoroughly down-to-earth, polite, earnest, but with a sense of humour, able to take the mickey out of himself. He seems like a really, really decent man. And actually, it could well be an act, but there doesn't seem to be an ounce of I'm the big Bono and I'm something special whatsoever. And so, when you traverse through the 90s, I think what people forget is they are working against what U2 were before. The pop album is a bridge too far, but I actually respect what they did then. They pushed it out as far as they could. They moved very far from their sort of guitar, songwritery, guitar, bass, drums roots. They're bringing in dance music, techno. Everyone was doing this in the 90s. It's their Kid A, Now, Radiohead do have a sort of snobby, upper middle class, elite sort of artsy fartsy view of the world, and they were able to use their great fame to make Kid A, which if anyone else had made it would have sold about 10,000 copies. U2 don't go down that route. So the album is called Pop for a reason. They are making pop music, but it's postmodern pop music where they're aware of the process. Now, if I go back to 2000, I can remember doing a gig in Dublin, and I went backstage and there was a guy in the dressing room, and I started chatting to him, and it turned out that he was a mix engineer for U2. And he said he'd actually been in the studio with U2 that day, just finished up doing some work, and then he's come over to see the gig I was playing in Dublin. And I can remember him saying, oh, what's the new U2 album? And he went, it's an absolute cracker. It's really brilliant. So we'd been mixing the first single. I said, what's it like? He said, it's brilliant, beautiful day. And I remember this because I was like, oh yeah. I remember the title. And then, you know, 6 months later, this record comes out. And what's that album called, All That You Leave Behind? That album is a consolidation of everything they've done up to that point. And they hit home and they still have number ones. And they keep doing this. Throughout the early 2000s, they're still hitting hard. And if you think about it, when you get up to sort of 2006, this band's been around for now, was it 40 years? They really haven't made a bad album. I think the point where Bono really starts to question their I can never say this word, relevance, is the point where they look at the biggest thing that's happening in the music industry at that time, and that's the downloading to streaming thing going on, the collapse of the distribution, in the digital recording, the collapse of the big studios. And so in the post-Napster world, U2 try and deal with it by putting an album out for free. And Radiohead, who was sort of traversing that, they do the same thing. They just like, you can have this album for free. And your feeling is, when Radiohead do it, you go, oh yeah, well, you can afford to do it. That doesn't help any up and coming artist. But what U2 did is they utilised their huge celebrity power, political power, to sort of go to Apple and say, can we have our album put out for free? And I think it's a noble intention that backfired. And suddenly the band look like they're part of the sort of elite. They're part of they're part of the oligarchs. They're a part of the system. And in the last 20 years or so, there has been a growing distrust of the system. And there has been this move to popularism within people. And I can't help but think that U2 have gone from being the band that represented the people in 1980, these just regular guys, not virtuoso musicians, they've formed a band, they've done it themselves, they put the records out and they're singing these songs and they're saying it like it is, they're putting it to the man. The rock and roll myth, they're putting it to the man and saying this is wrong and that's wrong. And they've tried to turn away from that by doing the whole postmodern, ironic, we are rock stars and we do know what we are. And I think they do. But there is this certain point when they put that album up on iTunes where I think they're so removed from the audience that there's nothing they can really do at that point. They have been so successful. The only thing that would have possibly saved them, I think, would have been to have stopped at a certain point. Probably in 2000 with A Beautiful Day, because after that point, there's a certain reticence. Now, I think songs like Vertigo, which are nonsense pop songs, and people have pointed this out, and the sort of stealing of hooks from other pop songs and the sort of trite lyrics. You have to ask yourself, does Bono not know how to write a song anymore? Or is what he's doing a creative statement about the world? Is it the fact that we don't like ironic U2? But what else can they do? What else could they do? How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, huge album, won every single Grammy going because they returned. They did the right thing. And so they think, oh, well, let's get Steve Lillywhite in. Let's just be the great band that we are. And they are. And they make some great records and all that. And they do all that. And what happens, and they're at that point where the Grammys, who are so slow and so conservative and predictable, went, oh, well, we didn't recognise them when they did War, or we didn't recognise them when they did the Joshua Tree, we didn't recognise them when they did Achtung Baby, but now, we will now throw every single Grammy at them. And that album is sort of destroyed by the fact that he won so many Grammys. It's like rock and roll has gone from being this countercultural populist force to becoming the establishment. And this year at the Grammys, it made you sick. It made you sick. Every aspect of it made you feel sick. And U2, whether they like it or not, are at the pinnacle of that. They're right at the top, at the apex of that crapness, and it's not their fault. And for me, there is nothing in Bono's temperament or the things he said. I haven't been able to find anything that I could say to you, oh my God, listen to what Bono said here, listen to what he did here. Now, I'm sure people will come up with stuff because it's out there. But when I look at that stuff, I'm like, that is nothing. You don't destroy a person on that. You know, this guy's a reasonable guy, a nice guy, very creative, and this is the thing that swings it. And I think this is where it's unfair, which is why this video has no ranting, and I'm not sat. I mean, if when I do this series, if I decide that the bloke is an idiot, now there could be a musical genius and an idiot. And I will say that, and then you will get, and I've done this so many times where I've taken the mickey out of people that I think are really incredible, but they can still get the mickey taken out of them. But in Bono's case, he is the lead singer of one of the greatest bands of all time, and they're a magical band. Anyone who wants to bash the edge or Adam Clayton or YouTube for not being able to play do not understand how rock music. If you want virtuosity, go and listen to classical musicians or go and listen to LA session musicians because they're virtuosos. If you listen to rock music and you think that Rush are great because they're technically great players, they're not really, right? U2 are an example of what rock and roll should be about, which is 4 guys in a room and there's a chemistry between the guys. And that chemistry produces incredible songs. It's something we miss now because now it's some 17-year-old girl sat next to some middle-aged guys who knows how to do Ableton Live. That's what we're listening to now. But, you know, 4 guys in the room, you know, working on their craft. And U2 are about the best at it. I don't like their music. I'm not a fan. But I could listen to most of their albums. I could stick on in the car and I would love them. You know, and I've always known that with U2, but going back to those first 3 albums, they're just astonishing. And I've got to be honest, if I was to say what I think is the best one, even though the Joshua Tree is sublime, even though Achtung Baby is one of the greatest musical statements in rock music, possibly, but my favourite one is War, because that is the sound. Now, what would have happened if they'd have stopped then? I tell you what would have happened. We would be talking about them in the same way as we talk about Joy Division. Because they're brilliant albums. What goes on afterwards has sullied these albums. So my point here is I think if you take Bono's image, his charisma, his ability to stand on stage and command, 30,000 people, his songwriting ability, his lyrical ability, and most importantly, his incredible voice, I would have to put him, maybe not in the musical genius area, but definitely up very high in the super talent, musical, rock and roll super talent. He's up there. He's up there with, he's an equivalent to like a Jim Morrison, who is another great songwriter, but with a greater voice. Bono is the real deal. That is the answer. He's the real deal, and he's not annoying. And that's why he hasn't earned my wrath on this video. He's all right. He's good. I like him. And it's actually changed my mind. I actually went searching around. I thought, I'm going to buy these CDs. I don't know if I'm getting older and able to appreciate more, or doing this channel and understanding, because I keep I'm doing so much research into music history, pop music, cultural history, and understanding how wonderful this period was that we grew up in, the period of rock music. And they really are the worthy successor to the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin. They really are. They are the 80s version of that. And for that, they need to be commended. Right, now, all the way through this, I was thinking that Maybe we've got the situation, the Coldplay situation. Coldplay made a good album. Their first album was a good album again because it was a rock band in a room playing. They wrote some good songs. And then as they got bigger and bigger, and same thing with Chris Martin. Chris Martin is really great at controlling a stadium. There's certain artists have this. Watching him last year at Glastonbury, I could see he could control a stadium, right? And because of that, they get driven towards becoming more and more commercial. And now they're just a glorified pop group. There's not even anyone playing on the albums, I don't think, anymore. But I thought this is what had happened to U2. Quite good in the beginning, did some cool stuff, blah, blah. It's not the case. We have a run of nearly 40 years of incredible albums. Their worst albums are still really great, and you can sit and listen to them. There's nothing tacky about them. And all the way through that, they have pushed the elements. They're a proper rock band. They're heavy. They've got like distorted guitars. Bono, I was watching one video of Bono, and it's Live Under a Blood Red Sky, and The Edge shouts, "Ladies and gentlemen, The Edge." He steps forward and he does a guitar solo. And he's commanding the stage. Yeah, he's not Jimi Hendrix, but that's not what was required. I've got to be honest. They've gone up in my estimation doing this. So this is what it's about. I don't think anyone expected me to come up with a history of U2, but that's what we've done, and I'm proud of what I've been able to put across. I'm proud of championing this band. Right. So at the end of the video, what you'll see is in sort of a Roman way. Sorry about this, I've hurt my hand, so I've got this thing on, which it makes it more dramatic. So this one here, that one there, my right hand, that is annoyance, right? And this one is musical talent. So I would say that the conclusion of my research is musical talent, yes, annoying, no. I hope you like this series. I really am into this one. This has got everything. And I like the idea that you don't know whether there's going to be a rant or not. Now, I know you love a rant. And when an artist is deserving of a rant, you will get one. I can't just magic them out of thin air. I have to be inspired. And certain artists, when you watch the titles of this, you can see the artists that we're going to be looking at. Now, so this really is about whether you're going to get a rant at the beginning. I don't know whether I can do that history I did at the beginning. That's taken me about a week to pull all that together. So I don't know whether I can do that on every video. But I felt U2 needed it. I felt that there needed to be a history there that explained to people that are like me about how great this band is. So I hope you enjoy this video, and I will see you on the next one, as I always do. And we'll now finish with a message from our sponsors. Thank you very much, and see you soon.